Hello, everyone, and welcome to Food Safety Matters, the podcast for food safety professionals. I'm Stacey Atchison, publisher of Food Safety Magazine, and I'm pleased to be joined by my co-host, Adrienne Bloom, our editorial director, and Bob Ferguson, president of Strategic Consulting. So we're going to get started like we do with Adrienne sharing a little bit about today's interview.
Yeah, so today I'm talking with Dr. Claire Sand, a packaging technology expert, and we're doing a deep dive on chemicals of concern in food packaging, including PFAS. We also discuss what clean packaging might look like in the future, especially in light of emerging trends in the U.S. such as extended producer responsibility or EPR programs. So stay tuned for all things clean packaging later this episode.
Awesome. Thanks, Adrienne. We'll hear Adrienne's interview with Dr. Sand right after the news. But before we get to the news, I always like to give you a few updates on some of the other things that we have going on here at Food Safety Magazine. And, this time of year, those updates usually revolve around Food Safety Magazine's Food Safety Summit, being held May 11th through the 14th in easily accessible and affordable Rosemont, Illinois. Now, today, I want to share 5 more reasons to attend the summit. Our Tuesday workshops. So it's one thing, but it's really 5 because there are 5 of them. So before the keynote, before the town hall, before the networking receptions or the exhibit hall, we begin together by rolling up our sleeves to work on real-world solutions to real-world issues. So preparing to talk about our workshops today, it really made me reflect on the fact that the opening workshop is really one of my favorite moments of the summit because it sets the tone for our whole time together. Everyone sits at a lot of big round tables, engaging in exercises, sharing experiences, solving problems, asking questions, learning from the experts on the dais, as well as the expert at the table next to them. It truly embodies the spirit of food safety and the incredible community that is the Food Safety Summit. And I think that it starts there, everybody coming together. And when I say the experts, many of our EAB members and other speakers they're just there in the workshops doing it all with everybody. It's just a tremendous opportunity to learn and to share, really unlike anything else. So this year, the topic for our opening session is leveraging AI for food safety, from strategy to impact. The session leaders are Cindy Zhang, former Senior Director of Global Food Safety Risk Management, Global Supply Chain at McDonald's, now retired, and Sean Layton, Global Vice President of Food Safety, Quality, and Regulatory at Cargill. And they have an all-star panel that includes Dr. Ben Chapman from North Carolina University, Liz Duffy from Walmart, Dr. Stephen Lyon from Chick-fil-A, Dr. John Spink, Michigan State University, and Dr. Matthew Stasowitz, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Now, I did promise five reasons. The next 4 reasons are the rest of the workshops being held on the Tuesday, which are navigating food allergens, insights and strategies for effective management, food safety economics, communicating the costs and benefits of risk mitigation programs for food safety, practical tips to improve food safety through psychosocial environment, and effective pathogen control through identification and management of sources and harborages in the food processing environment. You guys, it is so hard for me not to read every single name of every participant and presenter in these workshops. It's a who's who of food safety leaders that I know you want to learn from. So please visit foodsafetysummit.com. Check out the full program for Tuesday. We've got a nice at-a-glance agenda there, but you can drill down and see all the amazing speakers. And these, like I said, these workshops are planned where everybody works together and shares, and they're just really special. So be sure and check all that out. And remember, as a Food Safety Matters podcast listener, you save big when you register. Podcast listeners save 20% off of registration fees whenever you register. But if you register before March 31st, you save 20% on top of the early bird. So just use the discount code FSMatters20 when you register and save. All right, now we can do the news. But that was some news. There's a lot of great things in there.
Yes, there are. And so getting to our news of this episode. So first up is a regulatory update from FDA on labeling for food colorings. So historically, companies could only use a no artificial colors claim on packaging if there were no added colors at all. Now, with the MAHA focus on getting synthetic petroleum-based dyes out of the food system, FDA has now broadened that interpretation. So under new guidance released on February 10th, foods that contain naturally derived color additives, such as beetroot red or spirulina extract, can now carry a no artificial colors label as long as the natural dyes have been authorized under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Other natural food colorants FDA has authorized for food use since urging food companies to phase out synthetic dyes in April of last year include gardenia or genipain blue, gaulderia extract, that's another blue, butterfly pea flower extract, yet another blue, and calcium phosphate, which is a white color. The change reflects a trend toward clean label marketing, but it also requires manufacturers to ensure that these naturally sourced colorants meet safety, quality, and purity standards. FDA's issued a letter with resources to support industry in maintaining those safety benchmarks. You can find a link to those resources in the article in our show notes. So in line with reevaluating substances permitted in the food supply, FDA is also initiating a post-market safety reassessment of butylated hydroxyanisole, or BHA, which is a long-used preservative in foods that helps prevent fats and oils from spoiling. Originally listed as generally recognized as safe, or GRAS, in 1958 and formally approved in 1961, BHA is found in foods like breakfast cereals, snack foods, and meat products. The reassessment comes as part of a broader effort by FDA to systematically review chemicals that are already in the food supply. Notably, BHA is classified by the U.S. National Toxicology Program as reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen based on animal data, although human epidemiological evidence is insufficient. FDA has also put out a request for information to gather the latest data on BHA's use and safety, and the outcome could influence how other preservatives are evaluated going forward.
Well, I guess reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen is a long way from generally recognized as safe.
I'm gonna make a comment and just skip some of the details about BHA and things like that on this one. We can come back to it if you want, though. First off, I find that the first story that Adrian talked about as far as the colors, if you agree with what they're doing, and I think there's reasons to agree and not to agree, but I'm going to skip that kind of judgment. But if you agree with what they're doing,
you're skipping a lot here, Bob.
Yeah,
you're really skipping around.
I am trying to. But I think it's a good move if you agree with what they're doing, because it creates an incentive. If you want to move people off of petroleum-based dyes into some of these other dyes, then having it say, have a clean label, having it say no artificial dyes is a way to move people onto those products. Again, if you first agree with what they're doing, then this makes sense to move people to different behaviors. So we'll see what happens there and how that works. On BHA, I think this is interesting. I think this really is a opening that FDA is saying that they're going to go back and look at a lot of these different chemicals. Martin Makary, the commissioner of the FDA, had said in interviews that he's also going to add BHT at some point, another antioxidant that they're going to take a look at that's also been approved for some period of time. He said that they're going to look at that after BHA. The other thing, and I'm going to mention this only because it's going to come up later in the podcast, but there was a petition to ban BHA, one of these citizen petitions that has been on the docket since 1990. So the petition was placed in 1990. The FDA has delayed any action on it, and here we are in 2026. So keep that in mind when we start talking about citizen petitions later on. But this issue about working to get BHA off is something that's been around for a while, and there's a lot of background to it.
Okay, so in other industry news, Boar's Head has reopened its production facility in Jarrett, Virginia, more than a year after it was closed following a deadly listeriosis outbreak. That outbreak, which was linked to contaminated ready-to-eat deli meats, sickened at least 61 people across 19 states and resulted in 10 fatalities. USDA inspection records from before the outbreak revealed long-standing hygiene issues, including rust, condensation, insect activity, and meat residue on equipment. In response, USDA is taking direct responsibility for inspections at the Jarrett plant rather than relying on state inspectors. Boar's Head says it's made extensive food safety upgrades, including facility renovations, moving to stronger cleaning protocols under the USDA Listeria Rules Alternative 2 sanitation controls, enhancing environmental monitoring, and boosting internal testing and training. The changes are spearheaded by Natalie Diensen, formerly of Dole in the International Fresh Produce Association, who joined the company as its first Chief Food Safety Officer in May 2025. Along with guidance from a recently formed Food Safety Advisory Council that's headed by former FDA Deputy Commissioner for Food Policy and Response and industry veteran Frank Ioannis.
So I find this to be interesting. This is another one that we could have a long conversation about. But if I were going to look at what's going on here, first off, Natalie Diensen, I've had a chance to talk to a number of times. We've had her on the podcast. We know that she's very sharp and very well respected. And the team they have in place is a all-star team to turn this around. So my first thought is I have some trust in the team to turn this around, unless they hit some sort of roadblock that stops. But I don't think that the people in charge that we just talked about are going to allow that to stop them or stay with Boar's Head if they are stopped. So I believe that things are going in the right direction. I have no firsthand information to say anything about that. But in one of the articles I read where Natalie was able to make some public comments, she said that they've replaced the floors, drains, air filtration systems, and took more than 12,000 swabs looking for Listeria before they reopened. The equipment that had the main problem with Listeria has been replaced. She said the facility has literally been rebuilt from the inside out. So there's another way to think about this. It is the same Boar's Head facility that had the problems before. It's not the same people running it. It's not the same people working there. A lot of people have been gone. And if it's been rebuilt from the inside out, you could make the argument that it's not the same facility. So if we assume that those things are all going right, then it makes sense that it should be able to open and there shouldn't be a problem. We'll see what happens going forward. Now, there have been some other reports about other violations at other plants, and Natalie's made public comments about that as well, as we're going to get to that and fix that as well. So they have a big job ahead of them, and it looks like they're knocking it out. But again, on the last podcast, we talked about not taking non-hygienically designed equipment and putting it to another plant. You get rid of it and you bring new equipment in, which looks like what they've done, which is what the recommendation would be. So it looks like they're following sound food safety recommendations at this point.
I couldn't agree with you more, Bob. I mean, Natalie is such a strong food safety leader, and certainly there's a lot on the line. And then Frank, you start there and work your way out. And Natalie also wasn't, I don't believe Natalie was in place when they made the decision to close the plant, And I guess we felt, oh, they're closing it. That means it's, permanently closed. And, until proven otherwise, I think this team has full confidence and should have confidence with the changes that they're making. It's a lot on the line.
Agreed.
Yeah, and so tying in with the theme of accountability for foodborne outbreaks, Stop Foodborne Illness has petitioned FDA to stop treating the identities of companies that are linked to foodborne illness outbreaks as confidential. So currently, FDA considers company names to be confidential commercial information under the Trade Secrets Act, which means they're often withheld from public outbreak reports unless a recall is involved. STOP says that FDA's interpretation is inconsistent with applicable statutory language and case law. STOP also argues that full transparency could help public health officials and consumers because it could encourage sick individuals to report their illnesses, which would help with illness tracking and traceback. It could prompt people with leftover product at home to discard it, and it could motivate companies to double down on safety. STOP's petition also points out that the current confidentiality disproportionately affects produce outbreaks, which may not always trigger recalls because of the perishable nature of produce, but can still cause widespread illness and even death.
Well, in a perfect world, we would have been able to have Sandy on to talk about this personally, Sandy Eskin being the Chief Executive Officer of Stop Foodborne Illness. But we did reach out to her just to see, if she could send us via email some things that she might want to drill down on. And in her note back, she reminded us that Stop Foodborne Illness was founded by families impacted by serious foodborne illness, and that families involved in outbreaks deserve to know everything that FDA knows about an investigation. And transparent foodborne illness investigations also help ensure consumer confidence in the safety of the food supply. FDA's current policy of only sharing the name of a food company linked to an outbreak in limited circumstances is not required by law and does not prioritize public health.
That's a good comment. I also had a chance to read the petition that Sandy put together, and it is a lot of court documents and references to regulations and different acts and things like that, which I have to be familiar with, and I know that she is. But it seems like it's very well written and logical, and it makes a lot of sense. The one thing, and I wish her the best of luck. I hope the FDA addresses this and gives her, gets back to her and hopefully accepts the recommendations. But the FDA, under these citizens petitions, which is why I brought up what happened with BHA a few minutes ago, they have 180 days to respond. They essentially have 4 different options. They can grant the petition, deny the petition, dismiss it outright, or a tentative response with an explanation that can cause delays for some period of time. So that's where this petition, what it faces. Again, I wish Sandy and Stop Foodborne Illness luck that they get some action on this. But there's a lot of instances where the FDA has an out if they don't want to act on it.
Well, I guess we'll be following this and keep you up to date as things unfold, as some of those options are or are not put into play.
Right.
Yeah, we definitely will. And before we go today, in international news, the European Food Safety Authority, or EFSA, has set a provisional daily intake level for cannabidiol, or CBD, when used as a novel food ingredient. For adults, that level is about 0.0275 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day, or roughly 2 milligrams daily for a 70-kilogram adult, but this applies only to high-purity CBD products that meet specific safety and manufacturing conditions. EFSA also cautions that for certain populations, including young adults under 25, pregnant and lactating women, and people taking medications, there isn't enough evidence to establish a safety profile. So because data gaps remain, the safe level is considered provisional, and EFSA will revisit it as more toxicological and human data becomes available.
Well, we'll be watching that space as well. We'll be watching all the spaces. And as always, there are links to all the articles that we've referenced in our show notes. So if you don't already, we invite you to follow us on our social channels, LinkedIn, X, Facebook, and Instagram. Just search for Food Safety Magazine. And to take a deeper dive into all the great content that we offer, visit our website, food-safety.com. And don't forget, check out all of the agenda items at the Food Safety Summit at foodsafetysummit.com. Okay. And now it's time for Adrian's interview with Dr. Claire Sand, a global packaging leader with 40 years of experience in food science and packaging. As founder of Packaging Technology and Research LLC, her mission is to enable a more sustainable food system by advancing innovations that extend food shelf life and reduce waste. Dr. Sand specializes in leading cross-functional teams, developing technology strategies, and creating implementation roadmaps for complex packaging challenges across the food chain. With over 150 publications to her credit, she's a regular contributor to leading food science and packaging publications and has held adjunct faculty positions at Michigan State University and Cal Poly. Her industry recognition includes IFT Fellow status and the Reister Davis Brody Lifetime Achievement Award in Food Packaging. She serves on numerous editorial boards, authored The Packaging Value Chain, and co-chairs Pack Food Waste, a collaborative initiative addressing food waste through packaging innovation. Dr. Sand's career spans leadership roles at General Mills, Kraft Heinz, Nestle, Safeway, and Total Quality Marketing, with international experience in Germany, Colombia, and Thailand across R&D, market research, and commercialization. She holds a PhD in food science and nutrition from the University of Minnesota and both master's and bachelor's degrees in packaging from Michigan State University. And just like that, here's their discussion.
So today we are doing a deep dive on chemicals of concern in food packaging and what clean packaging might look like in the future. Claire, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, just to kind of dive in, first, could you maybe tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to focus so deeply on food packaging and also chemicals of concern?
Yeah, well, many of us have first loves, right? So packaging science was simply my first love. I know it sounds weird, but I just simply love packaging. And when I found it as a major at Michigan State, I just was all in, and met some wonderful people, and it's a great field. So yeah, it's just the science for me, science and packaging science and creativity and the applied nature of it was just really a big draw. With migration, I mean, that's really to me where the rubber hits the road in packaging. And, it can occur at different rates based on the chemical, the substrate, the packaging material, and then into different amounts in food. So there's a lot to deal with. So, but when I was an undergrad at Michigan State, I got familiar with what the graduate students were doing just by wandering in the labs, and they were, awfully nice. And then I was able to, as a PhD student, work at this institute called the Fraunhofer Institute. And it was in Munich, but now it's north of Munich in Freising. And that's really, and it still is the premier food packaging research facility in the world. And there, though, what we were doing, and this is in the early 90s, the EU was new then, and we were developing migration standards that the EU countries could all agree on. So it was super fun because like the Brits they were in the EU then were competing against us in Germany and the French, and we're all trying to come up with really cool, like the best standard. And that's what I was working on was migration standards. And so it was really, a great period of time, and I worked with some super smart people. And now I'm getting back into it. Probably, I mean, I've worked with it throughout my career. Like when I was at Kraft, we did migration work and things like that. But now just getting back into it is just simply wonderful because, well, I feel like our industry is ready, ready again
Hmm.
to immerse itself in chemicals of concern. So.
Hmm. That's a fascinating background, especially some of the work that you did, that you talked about in the 90s when you were studying in Germany. And it's really interesting to hear about some of the beginnings of some of these, packaging policies that, now we have these structures, right? But there's so much more work to be done still. And I guess that kind of leads into my next question is, when we talk about things like chemicals of concern or what does clean packaging look like, how would you define clean packaging and what does that mean in practical terms for industry and consumers?
Yeah, clean packaging, and the reason I think we talk about clean packaging is because we have this concept of clean food, right? And in a way, they're kind of the same. They're somewhat nebulous, but we all know what we're kind of talking about, right? But it really both relate that they only contain what's needed, right? So in the case of food, it's nutrients. In the case of packaging, it's all the protection that we need food packaging to provide, and nothing harmful. So in packaging, what's I think important to understand is we don't just add chemicals needlessly. Like in the food industry, we don't just add things we don't need, right? Everything really has a purpose. It's kind of like I guess the Marie Kondo extension would be, does this chemical really have a role, right? And if it doesn't have a role, then we're not going to use it. It's a money thing, but also just it's efficiency. We wouldn't be using it. So I think it's making sure what's added is safe and essential. So it's really in a way kind of cleaning up our packaging. So I like it. That reference, I think it kind of takes the negativity out of it a
Hmm.
bit.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to look at it. And, of course, when we're talking about of concern, one thing that's received a lot of attention from, concerned consumers and public health researchers and the food and beverage industry as well is the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, as we call
Hmm.
them. And those are key chemicals of concern in food packaging. So, what do you think makes PFAS particularly challenging compared to other chemicals like BPA or phthalates? And, what are the stakes involved for each of these groups regarding PFAS in food contact materials?
Yeah. It's I think one of the things when you think about BPA and phthalates, when we realized they were bad, we had ready substitutes. One of the substitutes for phthalates was, I think it was soybean oil. So I mean, it was just things that were out there. And when we think about what function they did, there was a whole host of substitutes. And fortunately, most of the substitutes were not what we call regrettable substitutes. In the case of PFAS, and one of the reasons it's yeah, an issue is that we made regrettable substitutions. And the most regrettable one was when we said, okay, long chain PFAS are bad, short chain are okay, right? It was kind of like avoiding a pothole by driving into a ditch. It wasn't really that helpful.
Yeah.
So, and this created a lot of uncertainty in the industry, but also I think a lot of distrust with consumers. Oh, okay, you cleaned up the packaging. Okay, yeah, we're using this instead. Okay, good. But that was regrettable. Anyway, so that's one big issue. The other thing is that we focus a lot on plastics and harmful plastics are and things like that. But with PFAS, it's primarily used, I mean, we do use it as in plastics, but we primarily use PFAS, at least in food packaging, as a grease and oil resistant feature for paperboard. So for things like French fries. Um, and what's unique about paperboard and a good thing about paperboard is we recycle it a lot, right? It's easily identifiable. You don't have to separate it out. You don't have to separate like polyethylene from polypropylene or something complicated. You see paperboard and you say, it's recyclable. That's easy. But a lot of our recycled content then, when PFAS was allowed for long chain and short chain, it's now all in the system. So it's in our recycled system. And there are situations where we do allow recycled content paperboard in direct food contact. And so that's trouble, right? And then PFAS is hard to get out. I mean, it's kind of like glitter. If you're doing crafts with glitter, it's just really, you find it everywhere in your entire house afterwards. The other thing that's interesting about PFAS and that's different from BPA and phthalates to some extent is that it has multiple sources. And so industry now, we're kind of concerned in packaging because we have these, PFAS intolerance limits coming down with regulations. And one of the sources of PFAS is water. I live about 30 miles away from the 3M site where they had contamination in the groundwater. That legal battle is now the dust has settled and everything like that. But, gosh, we use water a lot in packaging, right? And so it's pretty tough. There's a recent EPA decision that allowed the use of PFAS chemical as a pesticide to actually produce food. And so, gosh, we're worried about food packaging having PFAS.
Right.
What if the food has PFAS? Anyway, so it's kind of complicated. But as an industry, I think one of the number one things you can do is do end testing. We'll talk about that probably later. But testing the final package that you're going to use with consumers, super important, because of all these conflated sources and things like that. So that I think is the one of the big differences with PFAS.
Mm-hmm. Now, kind of continuing, along this line of thinking. So, I liked your analogy about PFAS being a little bit like glitter. It's very pervasive, and we know once it gets in the environment or the water sources or even the human body, it kind of tends to stay there for a very long time. Now, you wrote a great article for us back in December of 2023, and in that article, you noted that the origin of PFAS in food packaging, so, that is whether it's intentionally versus non-intentionally added, it's becoming less relevant, actually. And I guess my question about this is, why is this shift important for regulation and industry practice?
Yeah, it's an interesting shift. It's sort of like when you make a mistake and you say, well, gosh, I'm sorry, but the point is you still made a mistake, right? So sending an email to everybody by mistake, and you say, whoops, I didn't mean to send it to everybody, but it's still in everybody's inbox. Well, it's sort of like that with non-intentionally added PFAS. I mean, we don't mean to use it, but it's just there. The reason it's confusing is we talked about recycled paperboard, and if some recycled paperboard has PFAS in it, it doesn't mean all recycled paperboard has PFAS in it. But gosh, if we use recycled paperboard, um, does that mean it's intentionally added? Or if is it non-intentionally added if we're using we want to use recycled paperboard if it's safe for direct food contact. But the confusing part, I think, is this whole what does it mean to be intentionally added? We don't intentionally add, like I mentioned earlier, unless it's needed, right? And so in this case, it's not allowed to be intentionally added, but we might just have it in the system. For example, in the water, right? That's used to produce the food. Is that intentionally added then because we use water? So it becomes the net is PFAS present, and that is the net. So I think one of the reasons it's becoming less relevant is that the regulations, in California, from my understanding, there is no safe harbor for PFAS. And there's a number of other states too that do not distinguish between intentionally and non-intentionally added. I think it's something, quite frankly, our industry and country will need to address. One of the studies that we did recently for the US EPA and the state of Vermont was really interesting. And even the whole premise of the study, when they reached out to me to see if I wanted to work on it. And I, of course, said, gosh, this is amazing. So, what they were concerned about in the study is that they were worried that the quality of compost, that the compost that had been in previous contact with packaging would be contaminated with PFAS and with microplastics, but with PFAS. And so they were worried about it from a food waste standpoint. They wanted to compost all of their food waste. Well, gosh, if you composted food waste and it has prior contact with things that could release PFAS or microplastics, then you're contaminating the groundwater, the land, and everything. So it was just amazing. And what we found was shocking in terms of microplastics, but also in terms of PFAS, the multiple sources, conveyor belts, and
Yeah.
things like that. And so I think we're getting to the point where doesn't well, we don't want to intentionally add it. Of course, we're not going to intentionally add it. But gosh, if it's there, we need to figure out how to get it out. And it could be the source of the food, it could be source of conveyor belts, it could be sources of packaging, but we need to understand where it is and why it's there, and then make sure that the levels are safe.
Yeah, and I mean, in the case of PFAS, we know that these chemicals are very pervasive in how they migrate into the environment. But, I mean, some other chemicals of concern we might look at are, intentionally added to the food contact materials or packaging during that creation process. And I guess
Correct.
another question would be, so why does the food industry use chemicals of concern in direct food contact packaging?
Yeah. Well, gosh, I guess, you know, I think it is actually shocking when you take a step back and you say, oh, so we're using things that haven't been assessed yet? And you say, oh, gosh, why are we doing that? From a science perspective, things take time, right? Some of it is that, well, there's no reason to believe it could cause harm, right? That doesn't mean it doesn't, but we've had, PFAS is not the first one. Neither is BPA or phthalates. We had styrene acrylonitrile. We had vinyl chloride monomers. In the 80s, we had all these issues with packaging, and we just simply haven't evaluated it. I think it's over 60% of these 10,000 chemicals of concern, which is a lot, right? So, um, I think the main thing is we don't think they're going to cause harm, and we think that as an industry that because of that, it's okay to use them, right? Um, obviously we need more studies done, right? And this is where you put your science hat on and you can reevaluate and we do this as polymer scientists. We do this as brands. When you relook at what you're using, you're talking to your packaging suppliers. Hey, why are you using that? Mineral oil, different things like that. Why are you using this? And then, what can we look at as substitutions? So some of it is just, we haven't got around to investigating all of these different options. But we need to, I believe, relook at, gosh, are these safe? The other reason, or the second reason, is really that some chemicals are safe for one food, for direct food contact, and then not another. So it's dried pasta versus hot soup, right? Or dried pasta versus the pasta sauce. One is hot filled in the case of pasta sauce, the other one is just dried. And so we have different standards, in the FDA and all over the world, they have different standards for what type of packaging is allowed. So in some cases, you can allow certain chemicals and certain substances in direct food contact, and sometimes you can't. But the other reason that I think they just kind of sneak up on us is that we do have kind of a extended chain of custody in packaging. If we think about something like a lamination where you have multiple handoffs, chemicals can kind of accumulate too. So we may say, well, yeah, we're Ergonox 168, this anti-yellowing agent, it's approved, it's fine, right? But we may not realize that, oh gosh, one of the layers of lamination is PET. And then another layers could be polyethylene, and another layer could be like a reverse printed polyethylene. And all of these are laminated to paper, but they all could have Ergonox in them. And so the level could exceed the allowable level. And that's when you get higher levels of migration, of course, because you have, kind of building up in direct food contact and then it pushes through. So sometimes we just haven't gotten around to it. They're safe for one food, but not to another. And then we really need to grab onto our chain of custody and say, what's happening. As brands, we need to know what's happening in all the different chains of custody. And that gets back to the end testing. One of the things, the FDA doesn't always require end testing, but I love it because, gosh, things get complicated in the supply chain. And if you just measure exactly what consumers are going to be using, then you're safe. Right. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and we talked about a little bit, some of these standards and regulations that you have in, internationally, or they vary among U.S. states. Like you said before, there's no, California doesn't have a safe harbor provision for PFAS. But how do you think that these varying regulations, whether they're international or within the US, different states doing different things, how do these affect global brands and packaging suppliers? And, is there any advantage to aligning to the strictest standards to kind of cover your butt, or?
yeah, I think, to be honest, I think a lot of people are doing, they're adhering to the strictest standards. In is that wise? I think it is. Do you always need to do that? No. Some of the standards and how we even measure and group migration and address migration is different between the United States and, let's say, the EU. It's very different. We have, I think they've got a higher number of food simulating liquids than we have. It's just, the polystyrene standard is different. It's a little more complex in saying, okay, well, gosh, they're at this level, 50 ppm. We need to be at 100 ppm. Well, gosh, if the method by which you're actually measuring it is different, then then it's tough. So what a lot of companies are doing is measuring it according to, the different standards. So you'd measure, let's say, PFAS with, a European standard, and then you measure it with, a US standard. Or if you want to, ship products to, let's say, China or South America or wherever, you would make sure that it complies with that, those regulations. And then from a business perspective, all of the countries that you export to, you may say, okay, well, it's this level of that country and this level in this country. So we know that we need to keep it, at at a, at a defined level. And so it gets pretty complex. But yes, I think a lot of companies are doing that. I think it's better in the long run, certainly for business. I don't know if any company wants to be told that, well, such and such study, identified such and such chemical, right? And you've been using that for years, and there are so many scientific studies. It's just, confusing. So I do think a lot of companies are moving to that approach.
And so when companies are looking to eliminate chemicals of concern like PFAS and others, what are some of the biggest challenges that they face, especially packaging suppliers, providing the materials to put the food in, to implement these safer alternatives that don't have certain chemicals of concern in them?
I think one of the big things is transparency, which is also trade secrets with packaging suppliers. So working with them and really making them understand why you need to know something is really important. But, protecting trade secrets is also important. We have packaging engineers and scientists that may work for one company and then may move to another company. And, if you've disclosed that you've used these unique ingredients, to another company, well, then the knowledge transfers in a way. But I think the main thing is, getting into the ever popular unknown knowns and then the unknown unknowns, right? So when companies don't know if a chemical is safe and then just use it anyway, that's a big problem, right? So if we just, take a step away from PFAS, well, or I guess we could take a step into PFAS, but companies were told using PFAS is fine, right? And they used it. Well, that's okay. But then once we found out that it wasn't safe, we should have stopped using it right away, right? But when you get the unknown unknowns, when you don't have any information about it, and you the company that you're working with doesn't even declare its use, that's a big problem, right? And so knowledge is key. Transparency, working with companies, making sure that the suppliers are able to be forthcoming with things like resins, getting the resin and test results, digging as deep as you can and saying, okay, what processing aids do you use? You've got the resin and test result. That's fine. But what do you add to it? To make it unique. And that's when you might get into trade secret situations. And so it does sometimes get a little bit tense working with the suppliers and working with the brands. One of the things that we've found out works well is to kind of just have a firewall. So you have like kind of like a mediator between the brand and the packaging supplier. So the brand doesn't get that trade secret information. It resides in the protected wall, if you will, of the kind of like the mediator. And then the mediator can assess the situation. And so we've taken on that role, and it's an interesting role. But it's but the bottom line is brands really have to take the responsibility to make sure that what they're using is safe. And that takes time, brands are super pressed. Their packaging people are working hard to make sure that packaging is cost effective, sustainability, all of these reporting things that have to happen now with sustainability. So they're super busy, right? And adding this on is tough. So we've seen brands really combine their food safety people and their packaging people, kind of uh because it takes somebody with a packaging knowledge, but also a food safety knowledge to work in this area, and it's tough. Yeah. But again, I think it's the really transparency and just and making sure, what your brand is using, that you know exactly what is in direct food contact with your food.
Now, you mentioned sustainability, and obviously that, is a big concern, and it's a growing global concern as well. And one of the things that in the United States here that has emerged in recent years is these extended producer responsibility, or EPR laws. And I'm wondering if you can explain for our listeners, how do chemicals of concern, like PFAS or others, factor into these state-specific, because they are state-specific, EPR laws and other state policies on cleaner food packaging?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting about EPR is I think there's 40 countries now that use EPR for packaging. So the cool thing is we can kind of copy what everybody else has been doing. Europe, I think, started this in the late 80s. And so one of the things I think that EPR's laws do is they have to have a certain amount of recycled, the packaging has to be recycled at a certain level, right? So you can't just say that, oh gosh, this water bottle is recyclable, right? That's not okay anymore. It has to be recycled at a certain level. And if it's recycled at a certain level, then it can be, labeled as recyclable. But that also means that if it's recycled at a certain level, it's going to be used for something,
Right. Yeah.
right? And it's that used for something else that makes chemicals of concern kind of move to the forefront, because we have to make sure then, from a market perspective and from a market pull perspective of all this recyclate that's going to be used, we need to make sure that it has as many uses as possible and as profitable uses, right? So using it as carpet, fleece jackets, things like that is fine. But food packaging is relatively expensive, and pharmaceutical packaging is expensive, and things like that. So if we can pull through um, and make sure that this recyclate can be used in direct food contact or direct medical contact or what have you, then we widen the use, and then the value of the recyclate goes up, and then it will be recycled more and more and more. But in order to do that, we have to make sure that the recyclate is clean, doesn't have a lot of chemicals of concern, or it can be removed. One of the cool things about the paper industry is at Western Michigan University, they have, they have a pilot plant that's super fun to see, and you can actually, you can kind of visually see it, this filtration system, and they're filtering out with changes in pH and all these different chemicals, some of the chemicals of concern that are in there. So it can be done, but ideally, if you don't have the chemicals of concern in there in the first place, then it makes it safer. So I think that's pretty interesting. I haven't seen something, and I think I'll look for it after our call. But the what happened after EPR hit, let's say Colombia, in South America. I think it was just the last couple of years. Did the quality of recyclate, did the quality of recyclate improve? And using more direct food contact and things like that. But it'd be interesting to see that. But yeah, so it's got to be safe. For the recyclate's got to be safe, and that I think is pretty interesting. And that's just from a market perspective. We have to be able to use that recyclate.
Now, kind of harking back to you talked earlier about that study that you had worked on with EPA about compost. I guess there's some concerns with compostable or biodegradable packaging and the chemicals of concern that might be present in there. What are those concerns, and how can those be addressed?
Yeah, it's complicated. But basically, compostable packaging describes how something degrades. So it's kind of like recyclable, right? So it's compostable instead. But it doesn't mean necessarily that it should be used as compost, right? So just because something breaks down doesn't mean you want to spread it all over your tomatoes, your
Yeah.
tomato plants. And so, and that has to do with the compostable packaging standards, you know. So there's some interesting things going on with this. One is the California law, which I think is effective around the EPR timeframe, which is 2032, but it might be earlier though, requires compostable packaging to meet the USDA organic regulations. You think, oh, well, that's interesting. I don't know what percentage of it would now, but that means that, oh boy, then the dream of compostable packaging, which is you could compost your packaging, right, safely with food scraps, and you wouldn't have to worry about it, would come true, right? So that would be really nice. So I think the main concern is that people don't understand that compostable packaging should not be mixed with food scraps and used as compost. And that just has to do with the regulations and what is allowable as compostable packaging. Usually it's an industrial composting site, right? That the packaging has to go to. It doesn't go to the same site that food scraps go to. But the contamination is obviously a huge issue. The interesting thing about EPR laws is composting is not in those laws. It just focuses on recyclate, increasing the amount of recycled, kind of reduce, reuse, and recycle. It focuses on reducing the amount of packaging and then reusing some packaging and then recycling. Composting is not part of that because it's not really part of the circular economy because when it goes to an industrial composting facility, it goes outside, into like another stream. Doesn't mean it's a different stream or a bad stream, but it's just a different stream. It doesn't end up in the circular economy for packaging.
And, speaking of the circular economy, do you see a future where circular economy goals and chemicals of concern free packaging are, synergistic rather than conflicting?
I do. I do. Absolutely. One of the things I think, and I guess, when I spoke about, EPR laws and wanting to get, the best quality recyclate, sometimes I think we have to say to ourselves, that's not going to be possible, right? We're going to have to use some chemicals that, gosh, we don't want in direct food contact. So we might use them on that are indirect food contact. So they might be in the outer part of our packaging, right? But we still want to recycle that, right? But we may have to say, well, gosh, we are not going to use recycled content. We might come to that at some point. We're not going to use recycled content packaging in direct food contact. We're going to make sure it can be used, the plastics can be used for carpets and jackets and things like that, right? So we kind of have a decision to make. We need to make sure that we can control our chain of custody in the recycled packaging world. Like we do that. Some paperboard companies do that really well, and that's how we have recycled content. Paperboard, like Starbucks uses, I think it's 12 or 15% now, recycled paperboard in direct food contact. That's a very tight chain of custody. So we know that there's no chemicals of concern in there and it's totally safe. So we'd have to do the same type of thing for our recyclate, in for plastics and expand all of that in paperboard to make sure that the recycled content is safe for direct food contact. Or we'd have to say, well, gosh, let's not have recycled content in direct food contact and let's just use it for picture frames, carpets, fleeces, things like that. So I think we're going to actually have to make some type of decision there. So yeah, I think they totally can be synergistic. And yeah, I think that's all going to get flushed out. The economics of making sure that we have this tight chain of custody and we have safe recyclate to be used in direct food contact is going to have to be weighed against the alternative of not having direct food contact recyclate in certain situations. In like we were talking about dried pasta with, recycled content paperboard, totally fine. But in some cases, that is not the best situation.
Interesting. And so, what are some actions that you would say brands could take to ensure that their packaging is free of chemicals of concern? And maybe this kind of goes back also to the point you said, end testing is something that can be really helpful here.
Yeah, the first thing to do, I would do is just do kind of a risk assessment. You say, well, okay, what's our food like, right? So if we have a high oil food, a high fat content food, if you're processing or it's processed in the package or hot filled, then you might say, okay, we really need to delve into this chemicals of concern. But if you have a dry product, it's filled at room temperature or below, and let's say it's always stored in the freezer, then your risk level is much lower, right? So companies have a lot to do. So if we take a step back and we want to make sure that our packaging is not migrating into the product, chemicals of concern, then focusing on the high risk is definitely the best approach. So if you do then find high risk, then what you'd want to do is execute a stewardship plan, a package stewardship plan. And that's where you work with your packaging suppliers, making sure they don't have these chemicals of concern. That's when you do the end testing. And you might do spot checks. You might say, well, gosh, we're going to do stewardship every year. You might say we're going to do stewardship every time they change production facility. Things like that. One of the things that happened recently with tariffs and things like that is that people were moving production facilities readily. They were, moving entire molds and mini factories. And well, then you have a whole host of potential things that could happen, different chemicals being used, all of this type of stuff. So, you really have to keep tabs on your suppliers, from a legal standpoint as well, making sure that they have to keep you informed. But spot checks with end testing, always a good idea. But the main thing is it's easy to panic, because boy, we have some super large food companies these days, and to do testing and an evaluation of all of their packaging would be overwhelming, and it's easy to just say, gosh, I'm not going to do that. So focusing on high risk is the number one thing, and that really helps companies quite a bit, and really focuses projects, and kind of put some guardrails around the packaging that's actually at issue.
Mm-hmm. And if I could ask a follow-on question just about, working with packaging suppliers and that, having the stewardship of what's going on there. So, like for example, during the COVID pandemic, we saw a lot of supply chain disruptions, and, I think we still, as an industry, experience some of that. So if you're a food company and you have to substitute packaging suppliers for whatever reason, how can you, quickly make sure that you want to go with this supplier and use that supplier? Do packaging suppliers, are they able to furnish like kind of information quickly, usually on, what's in their packaging? I mean, what does that process look like?
That's a good point. Well, if they want the business, generally they respond very quickly, which is great. Right? And so yeah, so with polymers, it would be, end test results, or the resin test results. With things like paperboard, you get, oh gosh, a whole host of information from the packaging supplier, sources, all of that kind of stuff. So just requesting the correct information. For example, my company does this, and it's usually, I mean, we can get it moving in 3 days, or sometimes companies take 6 months to get back to us.
Yeah.
So it's carrot versus stick, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they want the business and you need to switch over right away, well, oh boy, they do it super fast.
Yeah.
But sometimes, in the defense of packaging suppliers, boy, they've got to go back to their suppliers right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Good point.
sometimes you as a brand would have to go back to their suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers. So that chain of custody I was talking about with a simple lamination, well, you might be dealing with the pouch company, right? But the pouch company is dealt with a whole host of other companies, and then they're the ones who put together the lamination and then make it into a, let's say, a pre-made pouch with a zipper. But you've got to really understand their whole supply chain. So they may have one supplier that has, changed locations. They may not even know. And so, really making sure that as a brand, kind of establishing those relationships farther on down, getting to know the ink suppliers, and things like that is important as well. So the main thing is just, focusing on getting the required information, and then of course the testing, the making sure that it's okay. Packaging professionals do a lot of what we call qualifications. So very similar in the food industry when you're qualifying a new ingredient, same type of process. And so in that process, in that qualification process, and if you're a company doing stewardship, that's integrated into that qualification process.
That's so interesting. And thank you so much for this discussion today about chemicals of concern in food contact materials and food packaging. And, also, what is the pursuit of clean packaging? What does that look like? So I think this is very informative for our listeners, and appreciate you taking the time to be with us on the podcast today.
Yeah, well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again to Dr. Claire Sand for joining us on the podcast today. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. We love hearing from you, so never hesitate. Send us questions or suggestions to podcast@food-safety.com or post a note on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, or Instagram. You know what I need to add in there is YouTube. Don't forget YouTube. Not so many notes on, you can comment on YouTube, and we do watch those. But anyway, I got to put YouTube on there. Anyway, we're always excited to hear your feedback. If you want to make sure that new and bonus episodes magically appear in your podcast player, all you have to do is click that follow or subscribe button in the player of your choice, and presto, bingo, all the episodes appear. And while you're there, throw some stars our way by rating the podcast, especially if you liked it. It only takes a moment, and it's good for everyone. And that's it for us today. Our next regular episode will post on March 10th. In the meantime, take good care of yourselves and those around you, and we'll talk to you then.